In the bitter February of 1856, the town of Cedar Mills, Ohio, lay under a veil of silence. The wind cut across barren fields, rattling the shutters of modest homes, and the night sky spread like black velvet, swallowing the fragile lights of lanterns. Within the brick walls of a Quaker meeting house, something more profound than prayer was unfolding. Beneath its plain wooden floorboards, in a concealed chamber of earth and timber, 3 cries waited to be born into a world that was not ready for them. The meeting house was more than a sanctuary of worship. It was Station 14 of the Underground Railroad, a place where fugitives pressed northward through the teeth of slave catchers and the law that hunted them like hounds. Its elder, Samuel Whitmore, was a man hardened by both faith and necessity. He had guided dozens to freedom, his face calm, but his conscience heavy with the weight of secrecy. Yet on this night, his greatest trial was not a fugitive at the door, but a woman in labor in the hidden basement below. Her name was Ruth, 19 years old, her skin the color of wet earth, her eyes carrying a knowledge too sharp for her years. She had arrived 3 days earlier, heavy with child. Her voice calm though her body labored under exhaustion. None knew her true history. She spoke in fragments, whispers of Kentucky, of escape, of cruelty endured. What unsettled the Whitmores most was her certainty, her eerie perception. She would speak truths she could not have known. The spoiled food hidden behind a fresh loaf, the real names of men who lied at her bedside. She had spoken the coming night with such finality that Martha Whitmore felt a gnawing dread each time Ruth's eyes closed in silence. As the first pangs of labor overtook her, the sound of boots and horses echoed faintly in the distance. Joshua, a known freedom-seeker, stumbled into meeting house, frost steaming to his mouth as he gasped. The Garrett brothers, they're coming. They know about the basement. Fear struck Samuel's heart cold. In 8 years of hiding souls beneath his roof, never had he faced betrayal so close. The house above shook with tension, while beneath, Ruth's breath deepened, steady, unnatural. When Martha pressed her ear to the swollen belly, Ruth opened her eyes, luminous in the candlelight, and whispered, 3. They've been waiting for tonight. The basement reeked of damp soil and flickering tallow smoke. Martha and her daughter Rebecca knelt at Ruth's side, their hands trembling as they prepared cloth and water. Above them, Samuel and the men ushered frightened runaways into the tunnel that burrowed toward the safety of distant woods. Time splintered into 2 terrors, the threat of discovery from above and the uncanny silence of labor below. Ruth should have cried out, but she did not. Her body moved with mechanical precision, contractions surging without pain etched across her face. Each breath was measured, as though she were listening to something only she could hear. The air in the basement thickened, and Martha later wrote in her journal that it felt like kneeling on holy ground corrupted by something otherworldly. The first child arrived in silence. No wail pierced the air. The boy opened his eyes immediately, dark and wide, locking onto Martha with a gaze that rooted her to the earth. His chest rose and fell as though he had chosen to breathe, not instinctively but deliberately. The second followed moments later, just as quiet, his tiny hands curling not in reflex but in what seemed deliberate movement. Then the third, slippery, silent, aware, completed what Martha would later call the most unnatural natural birth ever witnessed. Above, heavy boots stomped across the wooden floorboards. Voices barked orders. Dogs whined at seams in the planks. One of the Garrett brothers stopped squarely above the trapdoor. The weight of his presence pressed like doom itself. Rebecca clutched her mother's arm, silently praying. The infants remained utterly still, their black eyes tracking the vibrations of footsteps above them, as though they understood survival depended on silence. Ruth's lips moved, whispering in a language Martha could not name. Syllables like water over stone, soft, flowing, otherworldly. She cradled the 3 boys with serenity that defied the terror surrounding them. Hours dragged by. The Garretts cursed and stormed, their dogs restless, their tempers boiling. But the hidden chamber remained undiscovered. At last, hopes faded into the night. Only then did the newborns cry, together in perfect harmony. Their voices merged into a single keening sound that shook the earth-packed walls, that rattled Martha's bones. Ruth collapsed, her strength gone, blood darkening the straw beneath her. Her last breath carried words that would echo across generations. They'll know things. They'll always know. Then Ruth was gone. With Ruth's death, the triplets became both miracle and burden. In the eyes of the law, they were nothing. Slaves' children with no father, no records, no claim to existence. But in the small Quaker community of Cedar Mills, they were something more, an inheritance of mystery. Samuel Whitmore declared that the boys would be raised collectively, hidden from outsiders, their true origin buried beneath silence. The community named them Caleb, Ezra, and Isaac. From their first months, it was clear Ruth's final warning had not been a dying delusion. The triplets did not behave like other children. They slept in perfect synchrony, waking together with a start, turning their heads toward doorways where no one stood, until minutes later, someone entered, often heavy with anger or deceit. By 6 months, they refused to be held by liars. A man who claimed to have traveled from Lancaster drew their blank stares and rigid silence until, days later, he was exposed as an imposter. Martha kept notes of every strange incident. She recorded how the boys, before speaking a word of English, whispered to one another in the same flowing tongue their mother had used. When they focused on someone, they would tilt their heads in unison, eyes black and steady, as though peering past flesh into marrow of hidden intent. Community members laughed nervously, calling it childish mimicry. But Martha knew better. The triplets were feared as much as they were cherished. Other children shied away, unnerved by the way all three would fix them with a knowing gaze, or begin whispering before a lie was confessed. Adults, too, grew uneasy. For what man or woman, no matter how devout, lives without small falsehoods, without secrets? In the presence of the triplets, deception, no matter how trivial, seemed to burn. Dr. William Harrison, summoned to examine them, found nothing amiss. Their senses were keen but within natural range. Yet he confessed in a letter that the boys seemed to know matters beyond perception, as though sight and hearing stretched into the hidden recesses of the heart. He could not explain it, and in time he stopped trying. But word travels, even in silence. Soon, freedom seekers whisper the children in Cedar Mills, the three who could unmask traitors before betrayal struck. Conductors sought their presence, trusting the infant's strange intuition above the judgment of grown men. Cedar Mills became a coveted stop, not for its hidden tunnel, but for the gaze of 3 dark-eyed boys who seemed to pierce the soul. And so their legend began. By the time the triplets reached their 3rd year, the whispers in Cedar Mills had grown into quiet dread. Families who once volunteered eagerly to care for the boys now rotated reluctantly, passing them between households as though their presence were both privilege and curse. Caleb, Ezra, and Isaac did not play like other children. They did not stumble clumsily through early speech or babble with nonsense. Their words were few, measured, deliberate. More often, they spoke in that other tongue, the river-flowing language of their mother, each syllable soft, liquid, yet unsettling in its calm precision. The children of the town gave them a wide berth. Games halted when the triplets arrived. Laughter fell to silence, and little ones clung to their mother's skirts. For when Caleb fixed his eyes on another child, the others would soon follow, their 3 gazes converging like beams of unseen light. They would whisper to each other, then fall into silence, watching. The chosen child, usually guilty of some hidden mischief, a stolen biscuit, a cruel word unconfessed, would break into tears or run away, shamed by a knowledge they could not name. Adults fared no better. Even the most honest souls carried shadows, and the triplets seemed to sense them all. Samuel Whitmore himself, stern and faithful, admitted in a private letter that he could no longer pray in their presence. "They look through me," he wrote, "and I feel as though my hidden doubts about God himself are laid bare. Their eyes unsettle me more than the threat of any bounty hunter." The community called it the knowing look. When the boys turned their heads in unison and whispered among themselves, the air seemed to tighten, and silence pressed heavily upon the room. Soon, visitors to Cedar Mills whispered about them too, stories spreading along the Underground Railroad. Some claimed the boys could smell a lie, others that they could taste sin. A few began to speak of them in fearful tones, not as children, but as omens. Yet their usefulness could not be denied. Twice in 1 year, Bounty hunters disguised as freedom seekers attempted to infiltrate the station. On both occasions, the triplets became inconsolable before the men even spoke, their cries piercing the air until Samuel refused the travelers' entry. Weeks later, news arrived confirming both groups as imposters. To many, this was proof of divine intervention. To others, it was something darker, less holy. And so the children grew, not merely into boys, but into enigmas, half miracle, half terror. The journals of Martha Whitmore describe one night in particular, when she was awakened by a strange sound. The wind rattled the shutters, yet what pulled her from sleep was not the storm, but the chorus of 3 small voices speaking in perfect unison from a nursery below. Heart pounding, she lit a lamp and descended the narrow stairs. There, in the flickering light, she saw them. Caleb, Ezra, and Isaac stood in their shared crib, gripping the wooden rails, their faces turned toward the window. Their lips moved together, uttering syllables Martha recognized as the same flowing speech Ruth had whispered on the night of their birth. But this time, the sound was not soft. It was rhythmic, deliberate, like chanting. Their eyes shone black as coal, reflecting the lamp flame. Outside the window, nothing stirred. The snow fell in gentle silence. Yet Martha swore she felt a presence beyond the glass, something waiting, listening. The boys fell silent the moment she stepped into the room. All 3 turned to her at once, and in clear English, Caleb spoke words that froze her blood. "He is coming." "Who?" Martha demanded, but the boys only stared, as though her question itself were meaningless. 2 days later, a fugitive arrived at the meeting house, bloodied, desperate, hunted. With him trailed pursuers, so close the hounds could be heard howling through the trees. The man had scarcely stumbled to the trapdoor before the triplets began to wail, their screams wild and discordant. They clawed at the air as if trying to push him away. Samuel, shaken but trusting their instinct, barred the man from hiding in the basement. The community later learned he had been a decoy, a lure meant to draw them out for ambush. The boys had known. From that day on, Samuel wrote, he ceased to question. He relied on their gift without hesitation. But reliance carried a cost. The children were no longer treated as children. They were oracles, consulted in whispers, watched with fear. Laughter faded from their lives. Their childhood dissolved into something far heavier, a burden placed on them by a town that had no other choice but to believe, as the years crawled forward. The strangeness deepened. The boys grew taller, stronger, but their unity remained unnerving. They rarely acted alone. When one moved, the others followed. When one spoke, the others nodded before the words left his mouth. It was as though 3 bodies shared a single will. By age 7, they no longer merely sensed deception. They seemed to feel violence before it occurred. Samuel recorded an incident when a passing peddler stopped to rest in Cedar Mills. The man was jovial, friendly, quick with stories, yet the triplets refused to go near him. Instead, they clung to Martha, whispering frantically in their secret tongue. That very night, the peddler was caught attempting to strangle a farmer on the road for his purse. The town grew dependent, yet restless. Some whispered the boys were cursed, perhaps even marked by witchcraft. But to speak such suspicions aloud was dangerous, for others believed them to be chosen, instruments of providence sent to protect the innocent. The truth lay in shadows that deepened with every year. The boys themselves seemed troubled by their gift. Martha's notes described nights when they would wake screaming, clutching their heads, crying, too loud, as though assaulted by voices no one else could hear. They grew pale and withdrawn after such episodes, unwilling to eat or speak for days. Then came the night of the fire. A barn at the edge of town erupted in flames, the sky glowing red against the black. As the alarm rang, the townsfolk rushed to form a bucket line, but the triplets had already been standing at the window hours before, silent, watching the horizon where the blaze would later rise. They knew, Martha whispered to Samuel as smoke filled the air. Dear God, they knew. It was no longer a question of whether the boys were different, but how long such difference could remain hidden from the world beyond Cedar Mills. For already, strangers were arriving more often, asking curious questions, speaking of rumors carried along the Underground Railroad. Some came in hope, others in suspicion, all left unsettled. And the boys, now old enough to understand, began to ask questions of their own, questions Martha could not answer, about their mother, about why they were not like other children, about the strange words that rolled from their tongues like second nature, questions that would, in time, demand answers. By the time the triplets turned 9, Cedar Mills no longer felt like the quiet Quaker settlement it once was. The town lived in a strange tension. On one hand, the boys were seen as protectors, their presence ensuring the Underground Railroad remained secure. On the other, they were an unspoken terror. Mothers crossed themselves when the 3 passed by, children avoided their path, and whispers filled the meeting house after sermons. What frightened people most was not their abilities, but their unity. It was as though Caleb, Ezra, and Isaac were fragments of the same soul, split into 3 bodies. They finished each other's sentences, but more disturbing was when they spoke together, their voices weaving into a single sound, layered but unified, like a chorus born from one throat. Dr. Harrison, the physician who had tracked their growth, confessed to Samuel Whitmore that he no longer wished to examine them. In a private note he wrote, "When they look at me, I feel examined in return. As though my thoughts are pages in a book they are silently reading." The boys' abilities were not limited to deception or violence. At times, they spoke truths no one should have known. Martha recorded one winter morning when the boys asked her why she had hidden her mother's locket in the flour barrel after her death. Martha, stunned, admitted she had done so years before, never telling a soul. Another time, Ezra asked a farmer's wife why she still wore her wedding band, when she had secretly decided to abandon her husband and flee with another man. The woman turned white and left the meeting house in tears. The line between gift and curse blurred further. To live near the triplets was to live stripped bare, unable to cling to secrets, forced into honesty one might not be ready to confront. Cedar Mills began to fracture. Some said the boys were holy vessels. Others whispered that no children of God could unsettle the human spirit so deeply. Then, one night, the boys dreamed together. They woke screaming, their cries filling the entire town. Martha rushed to their side, only for all 3 to speak the same words through gasping sobs. Blood in the church. Blood in the floorboards. No one knew what it meant, but Samuel Whitmore prayed harder than he had in years, his lips trembling as he whispered to himself, "Lord, spare us from what's coming." The prophecy or nightmare that the boys uttered weighed heavily on the town. Days turned into weeks, and though nothing happened, the words remained etched in the minds of every man and woman in Cedar Mills. The meeting house itself seemed to grow heavier, its simple brick walls and wooden beams holding not only the weight of secrecy, but the echo of those ominous words, blood in the church, blood in the floorboards. It was late spring when the meaning began to reveal itself. A group of men arrived in town, dressed as traveling preachers, claiming to spread the gospel. They asked unusual questions about the Quaker meeting house, about its history, about the families who worshiped there. The townsfolk, weary but cautious, welcomed them with the guarded hospitality of rural Ohio. But the boys did not. The moment Caleb saw them, he began to scream. Ezra and Isaac followed, clutching their stomachs, retching violently though they had eaten nothing spoiled. Samuel tried to calm them, but the triplets fell into a frenzy, clawing at the earth, shrieking words in their mother's strange language until their voices collapsed into hoarse whispers. The townsfolk stood in shock, paralyzed by the sight. The visitors, unsettled, quickly excused themselves and departed that evening. Days later, word came that those same men had been arrested in Columbus for violent assaults. Hidden among their belongings were chains, gags, and ledgers filled with names, escaped slaves marked as property to be reclaimed. The triplets' outburst had spared Cedar Mills, yet their prophecy was not so easily dismissed. Weeks later, during a quiet Sunday meeting, the floorboards of the meeting house trembled with the arrival of a posse of bounty hunters. Guns in hand, they forced their way inside, demanding to search. The congregation froze, prayers falling from lips that barely moved. And there, in the very sanctuary, blood was spilled. A farmer, rising in protest, was struck with a rifle, but his head splitting open across the wooden planks. Blood seeped into the floorboards of the holy place. The boys had foretold it. That night, after the hunters left empty-handed, Samuel knelt by the stained wood, his hands shaking as he scrubbed. But no matter how hard he worked, the red would not fully fade. He wrote in his journal, "Perhaps it is not the wood that carries the stain, but our very souls." After that night, there was no longer any illusion that Cedar Mills was safe. The Garrett brothers returned again and again, convinced that secrets lingered beneath the Quaker meeting house. Each visit grew more dangerous, and each time the triplets were the reason the town survived. They seemed to sense danger before it struck, guiding Samuel and the others when to hide, when to flee, when to hold their ground. But with every display of their knowing, the community's fear deepened. Some began to wonder if the boys themselves were the cause of the hunters' persistence. Perhaps, they whispered, their unnatural presence drew danger like a beacon. By age 10, the boys rarely spoke English except when necessary. Their private tongue had flourished, a language no scholar could identify, though it carried the cadence of something ancient. They used it constantly with one another, murmuring in low tones that unnerved even the bravest souls. When asked what they were saying, they would only reply, "We're listening." Listening to what? The answer came one autumn evening. Samuel sat with the boys near the hearth, reading scripture aloud. Halfway through, Isaac suddenly interrupted, pointing to the fire. "He's here," the boy whispered. His brothers nodded in perfect unison. Samuel, startled, asked, "Who is here, child?" Their reply chilled him, "The one who waits." From then on, the triplets spoke often of the one who waits. They never described him, but when pressed, they would fall into silence, their eyes clouding over as though gazing at something distant and terrible. Martha begged Samuel not to encourage their visions, fearing what might be drawn from them. But Samuel, caught between fear and fascination, could not resist. The boys grew increasingly haunted, waking at night with bleeding noses, muttering that the one who waits had called to them in dreams. Ezra once clawed the wall until his fingernails split, screaming, "He's behind it! He's in the dark!" Cedar Mills, once a haven, had become a place of dread. For though the boys continued to protect the town, it became clear that their gift was no longer bound merely to human deception or violence. Something else was speaking through them, something patient, something vast, something that waited in the shadows. And all of Cedar Mills began to wonder, waited for what? As the boys turned 11, the town began to fracture under the weight of their presence. Families whispered of moving west, abandoning their land and their community, fearful what the triplets might bring down upon them. Others argued that the boys were chosen, a shield placed by God to protect Cedar Mills from the slave catchers and the violence of the world beyond. The arguments grew heated. At one gathering in the meeting house, a farmer's wife stood trembling and shouted, "Those boys are not a god. They are demons sent to lead us astray." Martha Whitmore, weary but unbroken, rose to her feet. Her voice, though cracked with age, carried authority. "Demons do not weep when a lamb is lost from the fold. They do not guard our children through the night. You fear what you cannot explain, but I tell you, fear does not mean evil." Her defense quieted the room, but not the unease. That night, a group of men whispered about taking action. One suggested sending the boys away to an asylum. Another muttered about drowning them in the river, before they grow strong enough to drown us. The meeting ended in silence, but the seed was planted. Meanwhile, Samuel noticed the boys drifting further from the ordinary world. They rarely played, rarely laughed. They would sit for hours in the fields, staring at the horizon as though waiting for something to arrive. When asked what they saw, they replied with the same words, "Shadows moving." Shadows that no one else could see. That autumn, the boys vanished for an entire night. Martha found them at dawn, barefoot in the graveyard behind the meeting house. Their hands were caked in dirt. When Samuel demanded to know what they had done, the triplets only smiled faintly and said, "We were listening to the dead." The graveyard never felt the same again. The following winter was the harshest Cedar Mills had ever endured. Snow buried the roads, livestock perished, and hunger crept into every home. The triplets, however, seemed untouched by the cold. They would walk barefoot in the snow, their skin pale but never frostbitten. their breath rising in faint clouds as they whispered to one another in that unknowable tongue. It was during this winter that Martha fell gravely ill. Fever burned her frail body, and the town prepared for her death, but the boys refused to accept it. They gathered at her bedside night after night, chanting softly in their strange language, pressing their hands against her skin. Neighbors whispered that it was blasphemy, witchcraft performed under the very roof of a Quaker home. Yet Martha lingered. The fever broke. Within weeks, she rose from her bed, weak but alive. Word spread quickly. Some proclaimed it a miracle. Others swore it was proof of dark powers at work. A farmer spat in Samuel's face and shouted, "You let those devils cheat death itself." But for Martha, gratitude outweighed fear. She clutched the boys to her chest, whispering, "You are not cursed. You are my blessing." Yet even she could not deny what she saw in their eyes that winter. They were changing. Their gazes no longer belonged wholly to children. There was something older there, something that looked back at you not with curiosity, but with recognition. That spring, when the thaw came, the boys carved strange symbols into the trees by the riverbank. Symbols no one could read. When asked, they only replied, "It is his name, the one who waits to be by the time they turn 12. The triplets were no longer regarded as children by the townsfolk. They had become an omen, walking among the people like reminders of some unseen judgment. Even those who defended them kept their distance, speaking kindly but avoiding their touch. The bounty hunters still prowled the region, hungrier than ever, but the boys seemed to know their movements before they happened. Once, they guided a group of fugitives through the woods at night, leading them past armed men who waited with chains and dogs. When asked how they knew the way, Ezra replied simply, "They told us." "Who told you?" Samuel pressed. The three answered in unison, "The shadows." The shadows that whispered, the shadows that listened. Samuel's faith began to falter. He filled his journal with scripture, desperate to anchor himself, but his prayers grew hollow. He wrote of waking in the night to find the boys standing at the foot of his bed, staring at him, their mouths moving silently. He could not hear the words, but he felt them pressing against his thoughts, filling him with images of darkness, rivers of blood, and endless waiting. One evening, as the town gathered for worship, the boys refused to enter the meeting house. They stood outside in the dusk, watching with unblinking eyes. When Samuel begged them to come in, Caleb shook his head and said, "He does not like this place. He says it is not ours." The congregation shuddered. That night, for the first time in his life, Samuel Whitmore questioned whether the God he prayed to was the only presence that listened. The year was 1869, when the first true violence struck Cedar Mills. A drifter, emboldened by whiskey, stormed into the meeting house during worship, demanding food and coin. When Samuel tried to reason with him, the man drew a pistol. Before anyone could move, the triplets appeared in the doorway, silent, still. The drifter froze. His hands trembled. His face went white as though he had seen something no one else could. He dropped the pistol, stumbled backward, and fled into the night. The congregation sat in stunned silence, staring at the boys. Hours later, the man was found miles outside town, his body twisted in the snow. His eyes were wide, his mouth stretched in a scream that had never left his throat. No wound, no blood, no cause of death. Just terror carved into his face. From that day, the triplets were no longer merely feared. They were obeyed. The townsfolk began leaving offerings at the Whitmore farm, bread, milk, even small trinkets, as though paying tribute to something they dared not anger. Samuel tried to refuse the gifts, but the boys would gather them, smiling faintly, whispering among themselves in that language. Martha insisted it was gratitude. Samuel knew better. It was worship, and worship always had a price. The deeper the town fell under the boy's shadow, the more Samuel withdrew. He filled his journal with desperate questions, each written like a prayer, but answered only with silence. "Lord, why do you allow this? Are these boys your test or my punishment?" He began to notice small changes in the town itself. Families spoke less of God and more of them. A merchant claimed his crops grew stronger after the triplets touched the soil. A widow swore her dreams were free of nightmares when the boys visited her home. Yet, not all blessings came without curse. A young mother left her infant at the Whitmore's door, begging the triplets to protect it. Martha tried to return the child, but the parents had fled town by dawn. Weeks later, the infant wasted away despite Martha's care. The boys sat by its crib every night, humming softly until it drew its last breath. When Samuel demanded to know why they let the child die, Ezra answered coldly, "It was not ours to keep." That was the moment Samuel realized the boys did not see life and death as men did. To them, these things were interchangeable, meaningless. And if life was meaningless, what place was left for God? Whispers of the Whitmore triplets spread far beyond Cedar Mills. Travelers carried the tale of 3 strange boys who spoke to shadows and brought miracles or curses upon those who crossed their path. One spring evening, men came from the city. Not slave catchers this time, but men in black coats with polished boots and notebooks. Doctors, or so they claimed. They demanded to study the boys, to take them east where modern science could uncover the truth of their nature. Martha refused, her frail frame trembling with rage. Samuel backed her, though his faith wavered. The doctors pressed, offering money, promising fame and answers. It was the triplets who ended the discussion. They rose from their seats and stood together, their pale faces expressionless. Then in perfect unison, they spoke, not in their secret tongue, but in plain English. Their voices were one, braided into a sound that shook the rafters. "You will not take us. He is coming. He will not allow it." The men fled before dawn. They never returned. That night, Samuel dreamed of the river. He stood upon its frozen surface, staring into black water that stretched forever, and from below, hands reached upward, not to drag him under, but to beckon him closer. When he woke, the boys were standing at his bedside, watching. Ezra whispered, "He showed you, didn't he?" Samuel said nothing. He only wept by their 13th year. The triplets seemed to command the very air around them. People swore the weather bent to their moods, the winds rising when they were angered, the sun dimming when they were displeased. Samuel dismissed these claims as superstition, but even he could not deny what he felt, a constant pressure, like a storm that never broke, surrounding the boys wherever they walked. The town was splitting apart. Half believed the boys were prophets, chosen vessels of something divine. The other half whispered of devils, demanding Samuel act before Cedar Mills was consumed. But how could he? They were flesh of his flesh, bound him as tightly as any child. And yet, when he looked into their eyes, he no longer saw children at all. He saw watchers. He saw witnesses. He saw something ancient peering through their young faces. One night, Samuel followed them into the woods, keeping his distance. He watched as the triplets stood in a circle by the riverbank, chanting in their strange tongue. At their feet, the water rippled though the wind was still. Then, slowly, shapes began to form beneath the surface. Figures, faceless and shifting, pressing against the ice as though begging to break free. Samuel fled before he could see more. He never told Martha what he witnessed. He only wrote in his journal, "They're opening doors." Martha, though aged and weary, grew more fiercely protective of the boys as the town turned against them. She called them her lambs, refusing to believe a trace of wickedness could dwell in them. But her defense only deepened the people's suspicion. A council was held in secret. Several townsmen, armed and grim, swore they would take matters into their own hands. Samuel was warned in whispers. They mean to end it, to end them. That very night, Samuel returned home to find the boys waiting in the parlor. They were seated perfectly still, hands folded, eyes shining in the lamplight. "They're coming for you," Samuel said. His voice cracked with fear. "We know," replied Caleb. "Then you must hide, flee," Samuel urged. But Ezra only smiled, slow and cold. "There is no need. He has been waiting for this." Before Samuel could press them, a sound cut through the night. The crunch of boots outside, the whisper of rifles being readied. Martha rushed to the door, but the boys placed their hands on hers. "Let them in," whispered Elias. And she obeyed, The men stormed in, guns raised, voices trembling with fury and fear. "Step aside, Samuel. Step aside, Martha. Those boys ain't natural." But Samuel could not move. Martha spread her arms wide before the triplets, shouting, "You will not touch them!" And then silence. The guns wavered. The men's faces went slack, eyes unfocused. One by one, the rifles clattered to the floor. The triplets had not moved, had not spoken, yet their presence filled the room like a suffocating fog, pressing into every corner, every thought. One man fell to his knees, clutching his head, screaming words no one understood. Another began to laugh. High, broken laughter that spilled into sobs. The rest stumbled backward, fleeing into the night like frightened animals. When it was over, Martha collapsed, her heart pounding, tears streaming down her face. She whispered, "God protect us." But Samuel knew God had not answered that night. Something else had. And the boys, they were smiling. The town never spoke of that night, but its silence was more damning than words. The men who survived would not meet Samuel's eyes. They aged overnight, their hair turning gray, their bodies bent as if something had drained them from within. Soon after, cedar mills began to wither. Crops rotted in the field before harvest. Wells turned bitter. Children were born sickly or not at all. And yet, the Whitmore farm seemed untouched, its soil fertile, its animals strong, its house lit warmly through every storm. Resentment festered. Some claimed the triplets had cursed the land as punishment. Others whispered the farm was not blessed, but feeding, drinking from the rest of the town like a leech. Samuel, desperate for answers, returned again and again to his journal, but his prayers grew shorter, more frantic, until they became nothing but cries of despair scratched into the page. "Lord, if you still see me, deliver me from my own blood." But deliverance never came. Martha grew frail, her body withering though her devotion remained unshaken. She clung to the triplets as though they were her last breath of life. They cared for her tenderly, sitting by her bedside, feeding her broth, singing her to sleep in their strange harmony. Samuel could not bear it. He knew she saw lambs where he saw wolves. Yet, when he tried to speak against them, her eyes blazed with fury. "Blame the world if you must, Samuel," she rasped, "but do not damn our sons. They are ours. They are all we have left." Her death came in the winter of 1871. She passed quietly, her hand in Ezra's. Her final words whispered not to Samuel, but to the boys. "Do not leave each other. Never leave each other." The triplets did not weep. Instead, they closed their eyes, kissed her forehead, and began to hum that low, eerie song. Samuel fell to his knees beside her bed, sobbing. For the first time in years, he prayed aloud, but as he prayed, he heard them whispering, three voices as one. Not to him, not to God, to someone else. After Martha's burial, Samuel was a broken man. He worked the farm in silence, his body bent, his faith shattered. The triplets, now nearly grown, moved through the house like shadows, silent and watching. But the town had not forgotten. With Martha gone, they believed the last shield had fallen. A fever swept through Cedar Mills that spring, taking children, the elderly, even the strong. Desperate, the townsfolk returned to Samuel, begging him to let the boys heal them. Samuel refused. He knew what they were asking was no healing. It was a bargain, and bargains always came with blood. But the people would not relent. They gathered outside the farm, shouting, pleading, demanding. The triplets stepped out to meet them. They raised their hands in unison, and the crowd fell silent. Then, without a word, they descended the hill toward the town. Samuel tried to follow, but something, an unseen weight, pressed him to his knees. He could only watch as his sons disappeared into the night, and the people followed willingly, like sheep to slaughter. He wrote one final line in his journal that evening, his hand shaking so violently the ink bled across the page. "It is no longer my house. It is his." When the triplets reached the heart of Cedar Mills, the town seemed to exhale all at once. Lamps flickered, dogs howled, windows slammed shut. And yet, not a single soul ran. They gathered in the square, their faces pale, their bodies trembling, but their eyes fixed on the three boys who now stood before them. The townsfolk begged for mercy, pleaded for help, for rain, for their children's lives. Their voices rose into a desperate chorus that sounded less like prayer and more like worship. The triplets did not answer in words. They began to hum that same low and unsettling melody. The sound burrowed into the bones of everyone present, seizing their breath. One by one, the sick fell to their knees, gasping, then rose again, their coughs gone, their eyes clear. The blind blinked at sudden light. The lame stood straight. A miracle. The crowd wept, shouted praise, fell at their feet. But Samuel, watching from a distance, knew better. For every man healed, another collapsed lifeless. For every child that stood strong, another mother wailed. The balance was cruel, precise. The triplets smiled faintly, as if amused by the exchange. The days that followed twisted Cedar Mills into something unrecognizable. The townsfolk no longer spoke of church or Christ. They gathered at the farm instead, offering food, livestock, even their own labor to the triplets. They called them deliverers, shepherds, the 3 in 1. Samuel watched in horror as his neighbors, once pious and God-fearing, abandoned their crosses for whispers and songs he dared not translate. By summer, the town had become a shrine. Men carved symbols into their doors. Women dressed their children in white and brought them before the triplets for blessing. The church bell was silenced, its steeple stripped bare, and always, always, that humming, rolling through the streets at dusk, seeping into windows, binding the people tighter each night. Samuel kept his journal, filling its pages with desperate prayers and bitter confessions. "They do not belong to me anymore," he wrote. "They belong to him. The town belongs to him. I am only the witness." But even as he wrote, he knew the truth. He was not just a witness. He was a father who would have been unleashed by the second winter. Cedar Mills was no longer Cedar Mills. Strangers arrived from neighboring towns, drawn by whispers of miracles. Some came crippled, others barren, others grieving the dead, few left unchanged. But each miracle had its cost. For every healed limb, a neighbor wasted away. For every life restored, another vanished into the dark woods, never to be seen again. The people stopped questioning. They accepted the trade. They embraced it. Samuel, gaunt and hollow-eyed, confronted the triplets one night as they returned from the square. "Why do you do this?" he demanded. "Why torment those who love you?" Ezra stepped forward, his face expressionless. "We do not torment," he said softly. "We balance." "Balance." Samuel spat. "You are killing them." Caleb tilted his head, almost pitying. "Father, it was never about them." Samuel's voice broke. "Then what is it about?" Elias answered with a whisper that seemed to echo against the walls. "It is about opening." And with those words, Samuel understood what Martha never could. His sons were not bringing salvation. They were building a door. After that night, Samuel could no longer sleep. He heard things moving through the walls of the farmhouse, whispers carried in the creak of timber, scratching beneath the floorboards like claws dragging along wood. The triplets moved through the house as if guided by some unseen rhythm, always together, always humming. One evening, Samuel followed them. He crept from his bed and trailed their shadows down into the cellar. There, by lantern light, he saw what his sons had been building. At first glance, it looked like a crude arch of stone and timber, but the longer he stared, the more wrong it seemed. The angles bent where they shouldn't. The shadows stretched longer than the lantern should allow. His stomach turned as he realized. The arch was not merely built. It was growing. The boys stood before it, palms raised, humming in perfect unison. The stones pulsed faintly, as though alive. Samuel staggered back, choking down terror. He understood now. This was a door, but to where or to whom, he dared not imagine. The people of Cedar Mills began to dream the same dream. They spoke of vast fields of black earth, a sky without stars, and a voice calling from beyond. Some woke screaming. Others woke smiling. All of them returned to the triplets, begging for guidance, and the boys gave it freely. They instructed the townsfolk to gather stones, to dig deep trenches, to bring offerings of blood and ash. The work was done in silence, willingly, almost joyfully. A fever of devotion had consumed them all. Samuel tried to warn them. He stood in the square, Bible in hand, his voice cracking as he shouted, "You do not know what you serve. These are not children of God. They are a curse upon this land." But the crowd only laughed, not cruelly but pityingly, as one might laugh at a madman. A woman he had once baptized spat at his feet and said, "Pastor, you have no faith." But they do. And in that moment, Samuel knew he was utterly alone. BY spring of 1872, the door in the cellar had grown taller than any man. Its surface shimmered faintly, like oil on water, and the air around it buzzed with pressure that made Samuel's teeth ache. The triplets tended to it night and day. Sometimes, Samuel swore he heard voices answering them from the other side. Deep, guttural, ancient. He stuffed his ears with rags, but still the whispers seeped through. He stopped writing prayers in his journal. Instead, his words turned frantic, disjointed. It breathes. The door breathes. I saw an eye open in the stone. God help me, it looked at me. But there was no help. The townsfolk began bringing sacrifices, goats, chickens, sometimes stray dogs. Their blood was poured at the base of the arch, and the stone seemed to drink it in. The humming grew louder, deeper, until it shook the beams of farmhouse. And Samuel, huddled in his room, realized something worse than any horror he had imagined. The door was nearly finished. The night of the opening came without warning. No bell tolled, no proclamation rang out. Yet the entire town moved as if summoned. They gathered at the farmhouse in silence, torches in hand, their faces calm, serene, expectant. Samuel tried to bar the doors, but the people pushed past him. They were not violent, only unstoppable, like water breaking a dam. They descended into the cellar, crowding around the arch that now shimmered with a pale, pulsing light. The triplets stood before it, their hands outstretched, their humming louder than ever. The sound rattled Samuel's ribs, made his vision swim. The door's surface rippled like liquid, and for a terrible moment, Samuel saw shapes moving beneath it, vast silhouettes, shifting in ways that broke the mind to follow. The crowd began to weep, not in fear, but in joy. They knelt, reaching their hands toward the glow. Samuel staggered forward, shouting, "Stop! You don't know what waits beyond." But his voice was swallowed by the hymn. The triplets turned to him, their eyes shining with something no longer human. "Father," they said as one, "it is time." The air grew heavy, suffocating. A wind poured from the arch, though it smelled not of earth or sky, but of iron and rot. The torches flickered, then extinguished, leaving only the pale glow of the door to light the cellar. The townsfolk pressed closer, arms raised in devotion. One man stepped into the light and vanished, not screamed, not burned, not torn apart. He was simply gone, as if plucked from existence. The crowd gasped, then cheered, believing he had been taken. More followed, mothers carrying infants, old men hobbling on canes, even children. They stepped forward eagerly, vanishing into that rippling surface. Each disappearance was met with more exultation. Samuel collapsed to his knees, clawing at the dirt floor. "Please, God, close it," he begged. "Close it before it takes them all." But the door pulsed wider, hungrier, and the humming of the triplets rose into a scream, a sound not of pain but of triumph. Then it came. Something pressed against the inside of the door. The surface bulged outward, straining like wet leather. A hand, if it could be called that, slid through. Its fingers were impossibly long, jointed too many times, covered in skin that seemed to shimmer between flesh and shadow. The crowd fell silent. Not a single breath moved. They stared as the hand curled against the cellar floor, anchoring itself. Another arm followed. Then something vast, unseen, began to heave forward. Samuel's bowels turned to water. He crawled backward, whispering scripture through chattering teeth, but the words sounded hollow, powerless. The triplets turned to the crowd, their voices unified into a single, deafening command. "Bow." And they did. Every man, woman, and child fell prostrate as the first shape began to drag itself through the door. Samuel, trembling, force himself to look. And in that moment, he understood this was no deliverance, no salvation. It was the undoing of everything. The thing that emerged was not a creature in the way men understood creatures. It had no single shape, no fixed form. Its body twisted and reformed with every heartbeat. At once skeletal and swollen, veined and eyeless, its surface crawling with mouths that whispered in languages older than the soil itself. And yet the people did not scream. They wept with reverence. They stretched their arms toward it, as though beholding their God at last. Samuel tried to run, but his legs betrayed him. His body felt leaden, pulled toward the arch as though by invisible chains. The thing's many mouths opened in unison, and a voice filled the cellar, low, guttural, vibrating the marrow of every bone. I have waited. The crowd shuddered, ecstatic. The triplets lifted their faces to the abomination, their eyes glowing like lanterns. Take us, they whispered, and the thing reached down, its hand blotting out the lantern light. What happened next was not death, at least not as Samuel had ever understood it. The abomination lowered its hand upon the triplets. They did not flinch. Instead, they dissolved into its flesh, absorbed like water into parched soil. Their voices lingered in the air, harmonizing with the many mouths, until Samuel could no longer tell where his sons ended and the thing began. The arch shuddered. Its light dimmed. For a moment, Samuel believed the ritual was over, that the creature had claimed what it wanted and would now retreat. But the whispers grew louder. The crowd pressed closer, and the abomination began to stretch, its form unfurling like smoke, expanding beyond the cellar. Through cracks in the farmhouse, through the soil itself, it spread into the town, into the night. Cedar Mills vanished beneath its shadow. And still, the people sang. Samuel's last account ended abruptly. His journal, discovered years later, contained only one final passage, written in a trembling, uneven hand. The door will never close. They are here now, not outside, but inside. God forgive me, I hear them in my blood. No record survives of Cedar Mills after 1872. Maps of Ohio omit its name. No census lists its people. It is as if the town never existed at all. But sometimes, when the wind is low and the night is heavy, travelers whisper strange humming carried across the fields, of voices rising from the soil, beckoning them closer. And those who follow, they are never seen again. The door has opened, and now you've seen what lies beyond. If you crave more tales of vanished towns, forbidden rituals, and horrors history tried to erase, then join us. Subscribe to Shadows of History before the next story finds you first. Hit the bell and step deeper into the darkness with us.